New episode incoming. We're in Manchester, Friday, 8:23 a.m. So today's title is called Euro and Cents, a Battle with Debt. And actually I'm going to give also an honorary case study about the Greeks during this period of the Eurozone crisis. And Yanis Varoufakis, he's been all over the news, right? So yeah, let's begin. I've just given you guys the context of this episode. So I want to start this episode actually in a different style, with a different approach. We're going to counsel ourselves on a religious wisdom to help understand European fragilities in terms of finance and debt. Now hear me out, it's a bit weird, but you'll see it makes sense later on. Since forever, Abrahamic religions, they have carried this radical view of debt. And what are those radical views? Well, the first one being that charging excess interest rate is seen by them as the sin of the usury. The second one they have is that outstanding obligations are supposed to be cancelled during times of jubilee, at least periodically cancelled. Sure, we can give that. Think about these two statements for a second. These old moralists, better said, they strongly resent the act of demanding repayments of debt that are, in many cases, unrepayable. Okay, that's what they're resenting against. So basically, if we were to take this macroeconomically, they're against the act of bailing out debtors to honor their debts at the opportunity cost of restricting new borrowing until these debts shrink. Okay? Instead, religious wisdom vouches for the suspension, or at least writing down, as I said, of debtors' past obligation, just so that new creditors don't need to fear if they want to throw their good money in a pit full of bad money. That's their solution. Maybe I'm moving too fast. Let's retract a little bit also and define what is a debt crisis. Once we have the definition and this concept I've just gave you, and we mix it up, we have a beautiful sandwich for the rest of the episode. What is a debt crisis? Let me think. A debt crisis occurs when credit that has sustained some sort of spending suddenly dries up, which makes it difficult for debtors to then service their debts, right? There's lack of credit, so debtors find it more difficult to fulfill their debt obligations. This is what happened, very briefly speaking, in the US back in 2008, and it had a spillover effect in Europe. We felt it more in 2010 during the Eurozone crisis. Without the access to easy lending that had been so available for them and so prevalent before this happened, firms and households, and of course subsequently whole economies, ran out of cash when their obligations fell due. And you saw this in the Eurozone, which is where we're going to focus. As soon as individuals and investors started abandoning government and banks, for example, removing their cash from checking accounts, they're also removing credit from the system, right? As soon as this happened, EU leaders like Jean-Claude Trichet insisted that countries like Portugal, Greece, and Ireland, which historically have had bad dealership with debt already, would have to still pay their outstanding debts in full, irrespective of what's happening around the world. Which doesn't make a lot of sense because given that the US just 2 years before had one of its worst financial crises in history and dried up credit basically for everyone in the world. But still, these countries have to service their debts even though there's no credit available. Okay, well, how do these countries pay for the debt then? The offer is simple. We give you a bailout. What is the opportunity cost of accepting these bailouts? Well, debtor governments like these will be ordered to reduce spending, raise taxes, essentially crunch their people with economic reforms. These are the demands by what they call the troika of creditors at the time that are going to give out the bail to these struggling countries. The troika being the trio, okay? The ECB, the European Commission, and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So let me see if I got this memo correct and if you guys understood so far as much as I did. Instead of allowing these countries to restructure their own debts by giving bondholders a sort of haircut in financial parlance, of course, the struggling banks received tax-funded bailouts that were good enough to prevent a total collapse. Don't get me wrong, formal bankruptcies of certain agencies, but not good enough at all to heal the whole banking system. That's not going to happen, right? Ultimately, their attempts to heal might have made it worse for these countries. Instead of resolving problems from Portugal, Greece, Ireland that I mentioned, it actually created a second Eurozone recession, then a depression in these hardest hit countries. Now, don't get me wrong, these countries are no saint states. Yeah, they had built up lots of debt for a reason since the conception of the euro. One of them being, of course, their lax position of having a euro, right? And thus they're being protected if debt ever goes off the charts. So, these countries have very bad policies, and then you jumble that up with their crude morality tales. So they knew they weren't in the best of positions. What they didn't know, though, was that in the other side of the Atlantic, the credit crunch would be so big that it would basically evaporate credit in their nations as well. Now, the bailout solution, though, wasn't any good either. Okay, it only went and perversely made it worse for these countries' debt problems. And nowhere more than in Greece, I'd say. I could go to Portugal. I'm Portuguese myself, but I challenge myself and talk about the Greek cause instead. I think the Greeks felt it the hardest. So you see, by 2010, the Greeks had a ridiculous deficit. It was around 15% of GDP. 2 years later, 2012, they were the first country to be bailed out. This to the tune, by the way, of hundreds of billions of euros we're talking here. Now, in return, as we spoke before, they are ordered to complete all these harsh austerity measures set by Troika, the dealers of this credit. Would it be unsurprising if I told you guys that these terms devastated Greece completely? Are you in any doubt whatsoever? Check this. Greeks became 40% poor in average, in general, statistically speaking. Unemployment easily surpassed 25%. You had this bailout policy aimed at preventing defaults, and 90% of that money went straight to creditors, propping up Greek banks as a result, all to the demise of a greater debt problem. Now you mix that with billion-euro corruption schemes happening there, and you have a pretty nasty plate in front of you, I won't lie. Now the Greeks went on to elect at the time this radical left-wing party, Syriza, and this party was the first actually in the Eurozone pledging to go against Troika. Okay, they were fed up. Guess what? 6 months later, their prime minister basically capitulated. They just accepted the bailout terms, which, by the way, by then, after they resisted, it was worse than before Syriza started to resist. So they got the worst deal possible. Then came to scene an interesting figure. You might have heard of him again, Yanis Varoufakis. I'm sure you've heard of him, actually. He's been mainstream everywhere. I don't know what he is, an opinionist, a speaker, a writer, I'd assume. Yeah, he has a couple of books. But at the time, he was this firebrand academic economist decrying for the Eurozone's ignorance of Greece. That was his goal, and of Greece's case. The same POV as what we mentioned earlier when talking about the Abrahamic religious beliefs of finance and debt. That is, do not order debt repayments to those that you know cannot repay these debts. Okay? Now, Varoufakis became a Greek finance minister. He starts there his uphill battle, what he calls the David and Goliath chase. Right? He enters office ready to spear, and although his convictions make sense, I'll give him that. He was dealt as well terrible hands right from the off. So basically, 1 month after taking office, the Troika bailouts were about to expire, and there was no resolution in the horizon. So basically, the ECB had all rights and pretexts to force the closures of many banks that had been non-committing to the bailout rules. So basically, if Syriza and Varoufakis didn't bow down to extend bailouts by Troika and instead remain fierce against it, the Greek people would basically be unable to access their cash in banks, as if they had any more cash in banks. I don't know how bad it was there at the time, but it was clearly a high-stake negotiation period we're talking about here with very little time for them to respond. Now, this quickly worsened. Varoufakis himself was very vocal. He wrote a book about this as well. I gave it a glimpse not too long ago. He called out the EU for, and I quote, caring more about forcing Athens to comply policy demands than about whether these policies would actually help solve Greece's problems. He said Christine Lagarde, at the time she was chairman of the IMF, if I'm not mistaken. I think so. Told him she agreed with his points of view, but said there was too much political capital in the game to back down now. So basically, he is calling for hypocrisy there, his claims. He said Germans had ideological blinders installed in them because they were axiomatically opposed to any debt relief suggestions he would give them. The French, he called them submissive people. He said the European Commission were all essentially NPCs. Let's be honest, they suffered from rigid mindsets. They were working with wrong economic models. They had big egos. And then, when he went to the UK for the first time, he became this really big sensation, right? He quoted from a poet, Dylan Thomas, right when he arrived. He said the following: "Do not gentle into the good night, rage, rage against the dying of the light." So he was very much a showman there, always speaking with literary allusions, calling himself David fighting Goliath, as we said, the Goliath of neoliberalism in this case. Yet while he was sort of roasting everyone, other Greek politicians were siding with the people he was condescending towards. They believed Varoufakis was actually chipping away the only goodwill Greece had to try and win over Eurozone to lighten up their bailouts. They were thinking, why the hell would our politician, Varoufakis, who, by the way, needs to broker a deal delight from his opposition, instead is rubbing his opponents the wrong way by making these claims. So he didn't even have support from his own team. What I take from this is that presumably Varoufakis believed that the force of his ideas alone could swing the wills of the powerful. And I guess, confidence can lead you in politics for sure. I'm not sure about overconfidence though. Now, Varoufakis worked on this game theory plan of his to win this fight against Troika. Sorry for that. Not touching anymore. It was one of bluffing his way out of it. Yep. How? He had thought of this game tree plan, which by the way, he admitted he taught in university lectures. So students know this, undergraduates know this, yep. It's a game that has 3 stages. The first stage, it's all behavioral, by the way, of course, if you know game theory. The first stage being Troika decides whether it will play hardball or respond to Syriza by moderating their demands. So the 2 branches. If Troika backs down, success, right, for them. If it doesn't, then Varoufakis has to go to phase number 2 of his game. Now in phase 2, Syriza government can either capitulate and just bow down to them, or to keep holding out for a better deal. If Syriza does that, and they honor their campaign pledge and hang on to their promise, then they move on to the 3rd and final phase of his game. Here, Troika must either compromise or Greece leaves the EU, which is quite extreme. He thought that could be enough for the Eurozone to be scared and accept their demands. You know what the problem was there? The EU did not catch that bluff. So by signaling he would rather a Grexit rather than give in to the Troika, Varoufakis may have convinced them he actually wanted Grexit. I don't think he wanted. This is me assuming he didn't want it, and this was all bluff. In that case, what is the point from the Eurozone's perspective, right? The EU's perspective. What's the point for the creditors to compromise, the Troika to compromise, since they can't keep Greece in the Eurozone by force against their wills? So Varoufakis, because of this thinking, he blamed the previous prime minister, Tsipras, for bowing down too early to the creditors. But, Oh, and yeah, by the way, I mentioned the first government, they only lasted 6 months. Varoufakis filed resignation after only 6 months as well. So just like his predecessor. Same level of success there. Now, don't get me wrong. All these finger-pointing stories that he wrote about in his books, it makes for a fun read. I'm not going to lie. But personally, I suggest reading it with caution. Actually, I think his books also reveal some of his weaknesses. What are those weaknesses? Well, when someone embraces many roles at once, right? He was a left-wing activist, he was an academic analyst, I would argue he was a poet, and he was also a public servant. So you can become very popular from this, but it undermines your ability to master the arts of politics, I think. So yeah, as much as he depicts plots, ambushes, even ostracism in his book against him, the truth is he lasted only 6 months, and no real resolution came to fruition. So to finish off, I'd say this. Any negotiator worth his salt should understand the game he faces. But the best negotiators, those are the ones who aim to change the game and create new common ground where none existed before. I think that's well said. And that right there is where an analyst's work ends and where the politician's work begins. Okay? The way Varoufakis treats his opposition in his book, from what I read, makes me personally believe it was the same way he treated them in office. Fair play to him for being the voice of ordinary people, which he was. He encouraged outsiders to demand that insiders raise their games, insiders in politics, right? People that had nothing to do with politics suddenly were interested in Greek politics for the best of Greeks' interest. But even then, even for that to happen, and thanks to that incentive, still, the new leader that comes their way will have to be a better politician than Varoufakis himself. I said it. So yeah, thank you. This was Nun Gomes for the Academic Observer on Economics, Business and Finance. This was quite an opinionated article episode, I guess it was, but I think it's fair as well. It's just something that popped up. Big thanks as well to this author called Martin Sandu. Do read his articles, they're very interesting. And he has a paper, he published one from the Council of Foreign Relations about this topic as well. I took some ideas from there, some thoughts, really, really good insights. But yeah, thank you, bye-bye.